I ignored my so's panicked pleas during a child's asthma episode and just sat there, feeling overburdened and frustrated. To be honest, this is likely the worst decision I have ever made, and I feel no pride in it. I simply need to express this somewhere. For some background information, I am currently involved in an abusive relationship. My significant other has children from a previous relationship, and their behavior towards me changed remarkably when I first encountered them. My significant other projected a very appealing persona, one that suggested they would never harm anyone. They appeared extremely kind and compassionate, which is what initially attracted me to them. They seemed deeply passionate about animals, just as I am, so when we began our relationship years ago, I had no reason to anticipate that it would develop into what it has become. As I delved deeper into the relationship, I discovered the true nature of my significant other. They have been physically aggressive with me on multiple occasions, sometimes quite severely. They yell at me, hurl every possible insult, and have told me I deserve assault and maltreatment. They have expressed hopes that I would experience assault. They have physically confined me within the house and deliberately damaged my belongings. The list continues. The sole reason I remain with them is that our lives have become deeply intertwined, and leaving them suddenly would have disastrous consequences for me. Moreover, they have threatened me during my previous attempts to leave. I intend to exit this relationship, but I must strategize in a manner that ensures I am not harmed for doing so, which has proven exceptionally challenging. However, my significant other isn't the only source of my distress. Their children have significantly impacted my life. Being around these children has transformed my perception of youth, revealing a level of cruelty I never thought possible. These children are viewed as cherished treasures by my significant other. In their eyes, nothing they do is wrong, and they are well aware of this. I have observed these children inflict harm on animals, assault other children, and fabricate stories to provoke my significant other into lashing out at me, all while these children smile and indulge in chaotic behavior. Their actions have caused me permanent hearing impairment and severe anxiety. I made every effort at the beginning of my relationship with my significant other to cultivate a positive rapport with their children. I would spend quality time with them, engage in conversation, buy them gifts, and care for them. They would act sweetly while receiving what they wanted from me, only to turn around and manufacture lies that would lead my significant other to direct their anger at me. Consequently, I must be brutally honest, I do not harbor any affection for these children. It may seem harsh, but if they were to leave and I knew I would never encounter them again, I would not react. I strive to evade them whenever possible. Although I occasionally attempt to maintain a reasonable relationship with them, I am continually reminded that it rarely ends positively. I am at my breaking point. I feel drained, deeply stressed, and overwhelmed. Sadly, everyone in the household has been ill for the past week. I began feeling unwell just a couple of days ago, and today I woke up feeling worse than I have in a long time. I can barely stand, almost faint when I try to walk, and have been confined to bed all day. When the children are ill, their behavior worsens substantially, and they often feign illness to get their way from my significant other. They have openly confessed to pretending to cough for no reason while smirking at me on many occasions. Therefore, I do not take their coughing seriously. Everyone in this household, myself included, suffers from asthma. However, it is extremely uncommon for anyone to experience an attack. I believe I may have heard of one of these children having an attack once in the past 3 years. This leads me to the reason for this post. The children have been coughing constantly today, as they typically do. Their coughing miraculously subsides when they get what they desire, such as watching television. My significant other prepared orange juice and attempted to persuade the child who dislikes it to drink it, after which he suddenly began coughing excessively. The children frequently employ this tactic to avoid responsibilities, so it is my suspicion that he started coughing like that to try to escape drinking the juice. My significant other became frantic. They rushed around frantically and attempted to have this child use multiple inhalers, taking him out onto the cold balcony, among other actions. Throughout this ordeal, I could hear my significant other sounding anxious. I was in the bathroom, and it was all I could focus on. As my significant other became increasingly distressed, their child also started to panic. My significant other entered the bathroom, urgently instructing me to find the paper straws I had left at a family member's house so that this child could use them to breathe. I informed my significant other that their panic was contributing to their child's distress and that they needed to concentrate on calming him down. I reminded them how this child had been faking this constant coughing for over a week and that the child might be panicking because of my significant other's anxiety. As expected, my significant other started to berate me, throwing objects and insisting that I locate the paper straws. I left, struggling to reach my family member's house without collapsing because I could hardly walk given how unwell I felt that day. This is where I made my mistake. I don't know if something in me simply broke or what, but I found myself sitting there. I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of being fed up with being yelled at, mistreated, and feeling disregarded. I felt trapped. I kept reflecting on how these children had found amusement in my mistreatment. Ultimately, I just remained seated. I located the straws and set them aside. I then deceived my significant other by claiming I couldn't find the straws and instead returned with a used straw that had been in someone else's drink in the fridge. When I got back, the child was completely fine. My significant other was not attending to him and was instead on the phone discussing asthma with their parents. I left the straw on the counter, knowing it was now pointless since the child was no longer experiencing an asthma episode, real or fabricated. Since then, my significant other has been berating me, insisting that I am in the wrong and that their child truly was experiencing an asthma attack, and that even though I have asthma myself, I have no understanding of this, and how dare I suggest that they influenced their child into an asthma episode, among other things. I responded minimally and reiterated that I did not want to engage in an argument. One of the last comments they made was, "I don't understand how you can be so indifferent to the situation. What if something worse occurs?" I feel conflicted because, although I genuinely do not have any positive feelings for this child, I would never want anyone to suffer severe harm or death. At that moment, as I sat at my family member's home, I experienced an internal struggle between immediately yielding and bringing the straws or remaining seated. Ultimately, I chose to sit still. My significant other has no inkling that I did this and believes I simply could not locate the straws and took longer in my attempt to find them. I feel like a terrible individual for this. I have simply reached my limit. It felt as if everything collided, compounded by my illness, and I just couldn't manage it. Additionally, I am perplexed as to what my significant other expected a paper straw to accomplish since the inhalers seemingly weren't effective. Nevertheless, I do feel profoundly remorseful and guilty about the situation. Story 2. I, a 46M, need help. My wife, a 43F of 18 years, cheated. It is a lengthy narrative, but I find myself in need of some guidance. My wife, 43 years old, and I, 46 years old, have been married for 18 years. When we initially met, she was in the process of finalizing her divorce and had 2 children from her previous marriage, aged 1 and 3. Once her divorce was completed, we tied the knot a couple of years later. Later on, we welcomed 2 children of our own, who are now 15 and 17. For the most part, our marriage was satisfactory. However, my sex drive was never on par with hers, and I faced challenges in forming emotional connections due to my mental health struggles. Approximately 8 years into our marriage, she developed a friendship at work. They became very close, and he eventually moved into our basement. He was gay, so there was no physical relationship between them, but undeniably, there was an emotional affair. She spent most of her time drinking with him. Naturally, I grew resentful and distanced myself from our relationship. I became engrossed in video games and devoted most of my time outside work to our 2 boys. Eventually, her friend moved out, but they remained close. Meanwhile, her drinking escalated to the point where she would barely be able to stand and would often forget the events that occurred while she was intoxicated. At that stage, we were living together with our 4 children. Our intimate life suffered due to my lingering resentment and unresolved issues in our relationship. As a side note, she had another friend from high school, someone with whom she had a past sexual relationship, but could not pursue further because he was married. I will elaborate on this later. About a year after her gay friend moved out, she lost custody of her 2 daughters due to her drinking habits. The girls reached out to a school counselor, and while some of their allegations were exaggerated or untrue, she was eventually deemed unfit as a mother. This situation led to a custody battle and complications regarding visitation rights. Eventually, both girls turned 18. One of them moved into our basement with her boyfriend just after the COVID pandemic. This situation brought about a new set of problems. The daughter was disorganized, never contributed to rent or groceries, and constantly left laundry in the washing machine. To complicate matters further, she and her boyfriend adopted 2 dogs, which they severely neglected. They kept the dogs confined in cages at all times, even though we had a fenced yard where the animals could run freely. The dogs barked incessantly, desperately seeking attention. Tragically, one of them died due to their neglect. This was the lowest point in our marriage. I voiced my concerns about her daughter multiple times, but since I tend to shy away from confrontation, I never addressed the daughter directly. My wife interpreted my frustration as an attempt to force her into a choice between her daughter and me. In truth, I merely wanted a harmonious home where I did not have to clean up after adult children. The tipping point came when the daughter left her laundry in the washer for 2 days. I have always done the laundry on Saturdays and Sundays to ensure the kids had their uniforms ready for school on Monday. Since she was negligent with her laundry, I removed it and placed it in a basket. That was evidently the wrong decision. The daughter became upset and ran to her mother, who immediately wanted to confront me. She instructed me not to speak to her, and I willingly complied. We went 3 days without talking, and even then, we never addressed the real issues. Soon after, the daughter moved out, which made my wife even angrier. During the move, they took all their belongings except for the dogs. They left the dogs in their cages for 2 days while they settled into their new place. I went to check on them on the 2nd day because the boyfriend, who was supposed to care for them, was absent. I cannot tolerate animal abuse, and when I saw the dogs, I lost it. They were being starved, I could see their ribs, and it was evident they were near death. I called my wife, crying and shouting about what I discovered. She contacted her daughter, and they came that night to take the dogs. Unfortunately, both dogs perished shortly after. Now that the daughter had moved out, the basement was vacant. It contained 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a spacious living area. My wife and I essentially relocated down there, completely avoiding each other. We lived as roommates for nearly a year. Eventually, for financial reasons, we returned to the upstairs and rented out the basement. At this stage, we were still existing as roommates, only communicating about essential matters. Anytime her daughter was mentioned, we would both become agitated. Things began to improve slightly around Thanksgiving, but then my wife made a comment that rekindled all the pain, making it feel as if we had returned to square one. Then, 3 weeks ago, a shift occurred. It was the anniversary of her mother's passing, and she was in a vulnerable state. She requested that we spend the day together. I begrudgingly agreed, but saw it as an opportunity to evaluate whether our relationship could be mended. While we were out shopping, she actually held my hand, something she had been avoiding due to my issues with physical contact. I expressed that I missed that connection, and we continued to engage. We ended up discussing and working through some of our issues. Things began to look promising. We made an effort to reignite our intimate life, but I continued to struggle partly due to performance issues that could be remedied with medication and partly due to overcoming a pornography addiction. Despite my prevailing doubts and longing for the freedom of my gaming time, I reminded myself that this is the woman I chose and wished to share my life with. Then, everything crumbled. I have always struggled with trust issues and have occasionally rifled through her phone, even though I recognize it is wrong. She has been using Telegram for years to communicate with her high school friend. Until now, I had only witnessed mild flirting, some inappropriate pictures, and references to photos she had sent but deleted. It bothered me, but I rationalized it by thinking it was not physical. After all, I enjoyed pornography, so she could have an outlet too, right? I was mistaken. She had some old phones lying around that I intended to trade in for cash. Before doing so, I wanted to ensure they were wiped. When I powered one on, I found everything from August and earlier still saved. That's when I discovered all the Telegram messages indicating that she, her high school friend, and his wife had engaged in sexual encounters on multiple occasions. If she had disclosed this to me beforehand, perhaps I could have accepted it. I might have even wanted to be part of it in some capacity. However, she chose to deceive me and kept it a secret. Now, I find myself at a crossroads. Should I pursue a divorce? Should I revert to being merely roommates and allow her to live her life as she wishes? Summary. My wife and I have been married for 18 years, but our relationship has been challenged due to emotional disconnection, her excessive drinking, and conflicts arising from her children from a prior marriage. She formed an emotional attachment with a gay friend who lived in our basement, which fueled my resentment. Subsequently, her drinking led to her losing custody of her daughters, one of whom moved in with her boyfriend and introduced significant household issues, including the neglect of dogs, which tragically resulted in their deaths. Our relationship deteriorated to the point where we lived as mere roommates for years. Recently, we attempted to reconnect, and things appeared to improve until I uncovered messages on an old phone revealing that she had secretly engaged in a sexual relationship with an old high school friend and his wife. I feel utterly betrayed and am uncertain about my next steps. Story 3. How can I make my 27F husband, 28M, understand my needs, or how do I deal? I, 27F, adore my husband, 28M, of 9 years immensely. Let's refer to him as Jake. He is an exceptional man, insanely hardworking, incredibly funny, fiercely loyal, generous, kind, humble, intelligent, health-conscious, with exceptional hygiene and a mindful approach to diet and exercise, and quite attractive as well. He is the type of person who is always assisting elderly individuals and would drop whatever he is doing to help a family member or friend in need. I assure you, I'm not fabricating this, I'm serious about it. I begin with this clarification because I do not wish to receive any comments such as, "get a divorce," or "if you're not happy, then leave him." Those remarks are not constructive, so please refrain from making them. What I seek is encouraging advice on how to navigate the following issue, even if it simply involves adjusting my personal perspective. The dilemma I face is that he appears to lack a distinct attraction to me, which undeniably affects my perception of intimacy. My initial thought is to assume that I am the issue, but I am uncertain about what actions to take that I haven't already attempted. See last paragraph. I find him incredibly attractive, and I am fairly certain I possess a high sex drive because I contemplate it constantly. However, I seldom feel inclined when we settle into bed. Generally speaking, he rarely makes any comments or shows physical affection that could indicate he finds me desirable. Apart from our routine, "I love you," as we drift off to sleep. There are no spontaneous kisses or even brief pecks. I have never heard him say words like "beautiful," "you're pretty," or express admiration for my appearance in any way. There are no hugs or quick squeezes of my waist or shoulders as he walks past. Occasionally, I receive the traditional playful smack on the backside, but it's clearly intended for humor, not attraction. He often joins me in the shower, but it feels purely practical. He continues conversing as if we were out in public. We rarely go on date nights. When we spend time with our couple friends, I consistently notice that later in the evening, they gather closely, with the men's arms around their wives, holding their hands, or even resting their hands on their partner's knees. Meanwhile, Jake remains on the opposite side of the room, seldom glancing my way unless I am the one speaking. I suspect others have noticed as well, since my best friend, who also happens to be my sister-in-law, has privately mentioned it to me. I act as though it is fine and that this is simply how we are because I do not wish to portray him as uncaring. I have long struggled with self-esteem issues, and this is undermining the confidence I do possess. Jake is always the initiator of intimacy, typically 3 to 4 times a week. I no longer initiate unless I am slightly inebriated or have consumed an edible gummy, as I now feel somewhat numb to the concept when we get into bed. Even though I may crave his body, the realization that I am completely unconsidered in that way until that moment severely dampens any motivation to act on my desires. Usually, when he does initiate, there's no gradual buildup, no kissing, no sweet or tender words. We simply get into bed, and suddenly, he is grasping my breasts, and within 15 seconds, his hand is in my shorts. I never say no. My typical response is to reciprocate mildly while gradually shifting away so that I can perform oral sex on him. Occasionally, this will sufficiently warm me up after a few minutes to engage in intercourse. However, oftentimes, I merely hope he wishes to conclude that way and be finished. The most recent experience compelled me to share my thoughts. I have been battling a cold for the past 3 weeks and am finally starting to recover. Understandably, Jake was not inclined to get too close to me during that period. But now that I am improving, here is what happened. After 3 weeks without even a single touch, no pats at all when we got into bed, he cuddled up behind me and bluntly asked, "Do you want to do something?" I tried to respond sweetly by turning around and moving downward. I smiled and said, "You haven't had oral sex in a while, have you?" He knows enough to understand that I wasn't aroused. He then said, "Do you want to use your toy for a minute first?" Which in my mind implies, "I have a need that I want satisfied, so can you please prepare yourself first?" No, I don't want to do that. I don't even engage in that activity on my own time because it feels like torturing myself with the notion of a passionate connection that is non-existent. I simply replied, "No, it's okay," and continued with what we had planned. Ultimately, he was pleased, and we cuddled and wished each other good night. I have attempted to convey my needs to him numerous times, with the last conversation likely occurring around a year ago. He is generally a good listener. However, while discussions might yield some short-term effects, they never result in lasting change, and I am exhausted from having to request affection in a way that makes me feel valued. I have explicitly explained that women differ from men, and in most circumstances, we require more time and build-up in order to feel inclined towards intimacy. I have conveyed that I strongly desire physical affection and validation, that I am desired outside of only the moments we engage in sex. I have also clarified that he doesn't need to do much to achieve this. I don't expect him to act as though he can't keep his hands off me around the clock. Just a couple of small gestures each day could make a significant difference. A single compliment or flirty comment, a random touch, whether sexual or non-sexual, at home or in the car, or a brief kiss when saying goodbye in the morning. I tried taking the love languages quiz a few years ago, doing it for myself, and having him participate as well. Not surprisingly, I scored high in physical touch and words of affirmation, while he scored predominantly in acts of service. I utilized this information to explain why I have always enjoyed engaging in physical contact with him, whether sitting close on the couch or giving hugs and kisses. Our concept of feeling loved differs, and that is perfectly acceptable. After discovering that acts of service resonate with him, I approached the things I was already doing with greater seriousness. I willingly handle all the cooking and cleaning. I wash and fold all his laundry. Whenever he is relaxing on the couch, I consistently offer to fetch him snacks or coffee. If he expresses a desire for a specific meal or treat, I make an effort to prepare it. I have always been inclined to give during intimacy. I strive to show him that I want to communicate my love through actions I know will have a positive impact. I have never ceased doing that. I prioritize complimenting him when he looks particularly good or attractive, which is quite frequent. I can dedicate time to wear a well-fitting dress, paying extra attention to my hair, makeup, and fragrance, yet he remains oblivious. Over the past year or so, I have reduced the frequency with which I affectionately touch him, as it seemed to have little effect on him anyway, and he has never seemed to notice. I am simply exhausted, and I feel like I must not be appealing enough for him to notice me the way most men naturally do with their partners. Listening to a song about a guy expressing how he thinks about his girl and how beautiful she is makes me want to cry. In summary, I desire physical affection and reassurance that my husband is attracted to me and loves me, but nothing appears to have any lasting impact. I would appreciate advice on how to discuss this with him, or how to shift my own mindset to cope more effectively with the situation. Story 4. Did I make the right call? I, 28 years old, male, recently ended my relationship with a woman, 27 years old, female, due to ongoing communication issues and misunderstandings that arose during our 2.5-month time together. Although we shared similar values, her sensitivity to my words and my difficulties in expressing myself in a supportive and validating manner resulted in frequent conflicts. I find myself questioning whether the breakup was hasty and whether therapy could have been beneficial. Hello everyone, here is my situation. I just concluded things with a girl I was dating, and over the past month, feelings of doubt and uncertainty accumulated. Our arguments frequently revolved around the distinction between my intent and what I actually said, which I had hoped to avoid. Ultimately, I became utterly exhausted, resulting in our breakup during an argument in bed on our Valentine's Day date, and I said my goodbyes. This was not the way I envisioned things ending, nor is it a moment I take pride in, but it happened nonetheless. My explanation of the problem is inadequate because, to be frank, I still grapple with understanding the root cause. It seems to stem from communication-related issues, but I believe multiple factors are at play that I struggle to comprehend fully. The backstory: I met this woman through a dating app and have known her for almost 3 months. Beginning from our third date, we had been facing disagreements and misunderstandings that I had never experienced before. The nature of these conflicts was twofold, primarily stemming from our communication issues. I often remarked on seemingly innocuous topics related to how I felt about our interactions or our dynamic, which might raise concerns. However, she would take my comments deeply to heart, experiencing significant hurt as a result. During these moments, she would typically withdraw and become quiet while processing her emotions. Sometimes, she would seek clarification on my statements, and often I would use comparisons, something I now realize was not the best approach to illustrate my viewpoint. Unfortunately, these comparisons would often exacerbate her feelings because they appeared insensitive, making connections between her and others. She would occasionally inquire if I had encountered similar issues in previous relationships, to which I responded that I had not. Frequently, my attempts to articulate the problem fell short and did not align with my intentions. In her perspective, I lacked consideration for her feelings when expressing these concerns. Consequently, I found myself in a position of damage control for the duration of our dates, with many conflicts needing resolution through text afterward. This cycle repeated every other time we met. I noticed that she seemed significantly more sensitive to my words after we shared physical intimacy, leading me to believe she felt particularly vulnerable and sought reassurance from me, even though she explicitly stated otherwise. A specific example from our last meeting illustrates this. When I arrived at her home that day, I accidentally sat on her bed without realizing she dislikes outside clothes on it, but she didn't mention it at the time. Later that evening, while we were under the blanket, she expressed her wish that I hadn't sat on the bed earlier. I then commented that I wished she had told me right away, so I could avoid making it dirty. I left the bed to lie on the couch next to her bed to prevent any further mess. She responded that it was fine since it needed washing now, so I might as well stay. Before returning to bed with her, I made a joke referencing a scene from The Office, mentioning how I resembled Michael Scott on the small bed. She interpreted this as offensive, believing I was likening her to Jan. From that moment on, her mood shifted negatively, and the conversation turned to how things would work if it were my bed. I explained that the layout of my room made changing the sheets quite difficult, as I could only access it from one side. I suggested we both shower before getting under the sheets, which annoyed her further because I wouldn't do the same for her as she did for me earlier. This led to even more frustration from her end. At this point, I felt resigned. Every time we reached this stage, I was engaged in damage control for the rest of the date, which could take hours and often required text conversations to resolve in the following days. She would struggle to sleep and indirectly blame me, which made texting increasingly uncomfortable. She even wondered if I might be on the autism spectrum, as she felt I did not adequately consider how my words affected her. I explained that while I strive to be mindful, I cannot constantly filter everything I say, especially in a relationship where I wish to communicate freely without limitations. She disagreed and insisted that I should always be considerate. I agreed, but explained that it requires such conscious effort from me that it often makes me feel constrained in my speech, akin to walking on eggshells. She interpreted this as a fundamental misalignment of our communication values. At one point, she even accused me of gaslighting her, perhaps due to my attempts to say the right things during arguments to prevent her from becoming more upset. However, upon reflection, I consider whether I was the one being gaslighted, though I am still uncertain. Yes, I made every effort to validate her feelings, yet I struggled to intellectually empathize with her emotional responses during arguments, as I couldn't comprehend how her interpretations of my words led to her feelings. My attempts at emotional support often felt unhelpful instead of understanding, but I truly exerted myself in trying to grasp her perspective. Ultimately, I concluded that her feelings likely stemmed from deeper insecurities unrelated to me personally and more reflective of her own inner psyche and worldview. The dynamic felt as if she instigated drama to prompt me to chase after her approval or affection, or to exert some measure of control over me. But I wonder, am I lacking the emotional intelligence she seeks? Regarding her personality, she told me multiple times that she identifies as a negative person who believes she is prone to depression. In all honesty, I believe she was fundamentally unhappy. I tend to have a joking and bantering nature and enjoy keeping things light-hearted, yet she did not respond well to this. Whenever her mood shifted, if I failed to notice it immediately and adjust my tone accordingly, she would become increasingly annoyed. This type of conflict arose in various forms about 50% of the time we spent together. I think she was more insecure than she allowed me to see, possibly unaware of it herself. So why did I continue seeing her? We aligned in our relationship goals concerning significant aspects of life, shared similar mindsets around career ambitions, and had comparable cultural backgrounds. Her sense of humor, when she was in a good mood, resonated well with mine. She could banter with me in a way that deepened my affection for her. She was an attentive listener, providing emotional support during my challenges, and demonstrated intelligence and consideration while valuing a tidy home. She was independent, not seeking a relationship just for the sake of having one, which made me feel she chose me for who I am, rather than merely checking off boxes. I have never experienced this level of communication, misunderstanding with anyone I have dated before. The mismatch in our communication styles was something I found impossible to resolve with her. I considered suggesting couples therapy, but given that we were only 2.5 months into the relationship, I questioned the value of that option. I am sure she would have a different perspective on the situation. Did I end things too soon without allowing for improvement? Story 5. Tifu by nearly getting a fentanyl contact high from administering CPR. This incident took place in January of the previous year, but it was an astonishing 45 minutes, so why not share it, right? It was my final shift during my second tenure as a security guard. In this second tenure, I served as the on-site dispatcher in a mall, logging patrol requests from other guards, monitoring surveillance cameras, dispatching personnel to apprehend shoplifters or intervene in fights, and coordinating with police and emergency medical services whenever there was an incident beyond our jurisdiction. If I recall correctly, I managed 4 overdoses during my time there, and each story has its humorous moments, don't worry. They survived. In any case, we are all certified in the use of handcuffs, pepper spray, first aid, CPR, and administering naloxone when necessary, as well as recognizing signs of an opioid overdose. Our daily shifts are categorized into first, second, and third shifts, with 2 transitional periods to manage the floor during shift changes, from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and from 6 p.m. to midnight. This particular event occurred during the shift change when the second shift was clearing out. I was the second shift dispatcher, but dispatch must remain until the outgoing supervisor accounts for the transfer of all keys, and at least the third shift dispatcher arrives. The third shift typically arrives late and often contacts the office to have us clock in when they are nearby, which was the case on this day as well. While I was addressing that, our 6 p.m. to midnight dispatcher called in urgently to request assistance from the fire department due to an overdose in the movie theater. I picked up the phone, called ahead, and ensured the loading dock was accessible for their entry. They take the elevators from there, and I contacted the guard for additional details. She informed me that a girl was unconscious in the theater and appeared to be unresponsive, and she had already used the naloxone that she carried with her. We carried naloxone in orange pouches on our utility belts. I started to panic because the third shift dispatcher had just arrived and needed to be briefed on everything. One of the third shift supervisors was still getting dressed, and the third shift lieutenant, who also worked as a firefighter, had not yet shown up. To make matters worse, all the remaining naloxone pouches were in the dispatch office, 6 floors away from the movie theaters, and the escalators were already turned off. So, grabbing several pouches, I instructed the third shift dispatcher to manage the situation until the lieutenant arrived, and I took off running up all those stairs. Now, most people quickly assume that because I am a young black man, I must be a great runner. However, that assumption is only partially accurate. I excel in speed, not distance. Frequent changes in elevation are even less favorable. So it goes without saying that the climb was unpleasant. Additionally, I had to grab an AED kit from one of the stations along the way. The alternate third shift supervisor, finally dressed, was right behind me, and we were both nearly on the verge of dry heaving 3/4 of the way there. Upon arrival, the officer who called in was performing chest compressions after administering the naloxone she had on her. I took over and administered another dose of naloxone while beginning chest compressions. For those who may not be familiar with how naloxone works, when you spray it into the nostril of an unconscious person who has overdosed on an opioid, which is the intended use for naloxone, they typically start to snore loudly as they regain consciousness. Usually, 1 to 2 doses are effective. This woman, however, was not showing any of those signs. If she was breathing, I couldn't determine. She was Hispanic, her skin was turning pale, and she was sweating profusely. Her hands were twitching somewhat. She lay on the aisle between an upper and lower row of seats, and the space was cramped. So as I attempted to bring my ear closer to her mouth to check for breathing crass, as this may sound, I was positioned at her head, essentially in an extremely awkward position. The fire department and paramedics arrived with a stretcher and their equipment, while I was fervently praying to God that I would not have to return downstairs and write a report about a fatality that management and corporate would interrogate me about the following morning. One of the paramedics approached me and began asking general questions. I answered to the best of my ability while still maintaining chest compressions, unable to confirm whether the woman was breathing, and debating the dishonor of performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on someone who had overdosed on an unknown substance. Meanwhile, in the background, the third shift lieutenant arrived and began questioning a man identifying himself as her boyfriend. The guy was very agitated, rambling incoherently, and amidst my chest compressions and internal panic, I overheard, "Nile pills." For reasons unknown, the room fell silent. Suddenly, I felt a strong grip on my shoulder as the paramedic pulled me up and pointed a finger at me, instructing me to halt while he shot a piercing glare at the boyfriend. I noticed that everyone else in the room was also staring at him in shock. With veins protruding from his neck, the paramedic calmly asked, "Can you repeat that for me, buddy?" The boyfriend responded with something along the lines of, I don't know, it's her birthday, I wanted to take her to a movie, and she said she had to take her fentanyl pills and... At this moment, the only thought racing through my mind was, wait, they make pills for that. Who thought that was a good idea? The firefighter paramedic quickly commended me for my efforts, moved me aside, and started administering care with another paramedic. I'm not sure what they did, as I couldn't see well, but the woman eventually started coughing, they rolled her over, and she vomited profusely. As I made my way downstairs to clock out, I began to feel lightheaded. Initially, I thought it was due to sprinting up 6 flights of stairs, likely true, but then I remembered a video of a sheriff's partner who had been standing just 2 feet away from some fentanyl found in a suspect's trunk before collapsing and seizing. Great. I finally reached downstairs. The third shift took over, and I clocked out while feeling dizzier than I had ever felt before, with my chest burning and breathing becoming a bit difficult. When my ride home arrived, I told them to take me to the emergency room, and I figured that calling ahead would help me determine if it was necessary to go in. Of course, I underestimated how long the wait times could be at the emergency room, even over the phone, so I hung up and contacted the local state police barracks instead. A desk trooper answered, and I provided a brief overview of the situation. When I mentioned that fentanyl appeared to be involved and described my symptoms, there was a moment of silence before I heard a whispered, "Shit." On the other line, the officer yelled to someone in the background, essentially relaying what I had just shared and asking whether I should go to the emergency room. In the background, I heard, "How long has it been?" The trooper inquired, and by then, it had been around 35 minutes since I had left work. He passed that information along. The person in the background replied, "Nah, it would have already affected him. He's fine." And tell him to stop trying to kiss women who overdose. That's the fire department's job. Having heard enough, I ended the call, waiting to return home and collapse. To summarize, I got uncomfortably close to an unconscious person who allegedly overdosed on fentanyl pills. I experienced a minor health scare afterward and discovered that fentanyl pills actually exist.